I'm sorry if there's a specific topic that I'm ruling off of today, but I am familiar that you guys are aware with the Kalam cosmological argument, and I would just sort of like to get your take on why it is that you either do or do not accept the premises to the argument.
We're totally familiar with the Kalam cosmological argument, but just in case the audience isn't, why don't you go ahead and explain it?
Oh, okay. Well, so you want me to just go through the argument. All right. So the first premise would be whatever begins to exist has a cause. Second premise would be the universe began to exist. And the conclusion would follow from that, logically, that the universe has a cause. Now, obviously, one could sit there and say, well, why does that cause have to be God?
Yes, one could.
And I actually sympathize with people who say that, because it doesn't seem like an argument that just leads you straight to the conclusion of God. You have to do a little bit more digging, I think. And I don't necessarily, I'm a theist and I like the argument, but I would also say that it doesn't necessarily lead us to something that somebody has to call God. If someone thinks that is a misleading term, or it certainly doesn't lead us to any specific God. I wouldn't say that at all. But the argument to me does seem to be very compelling.
You find it very compelling, even though it doesn't lead to a God?
No, not necessarily. It doesn't lead us directly to a God that we can. I'm trying to. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
I don't see how it leads to any kind of a God.
It doesn't prove it in the same way that.
I don't think it even hints at it. Something has a cause, therefore my toaster broke. There was a cause for it, therefore God. How does that? I mean, I don't even get it.
Well, I'm sorry, what don't you get?
If my toaster breaks, there's a cause. Why would I say it's God? I mean, how do I get to God from there's a cause required? Yes, there's a cause required for why my toaster broke. Why in the world would I assume it's God?
Okay, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, you were going to say something?
No. I mean, unless you...
Well, I mean, the other question, that is a good question, though. But the other question I usually ask, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, is what do you mean by the universe?
By the universe, I would mean all of space and time.
Oh, okay. So how do you know that began to exist?
Okay. Well, that comes with my view of the A theory of time.
Okay.
Some people appeal to the Big Bang. I don't necessarily like.
But when we talk about the Big Bang, that's a different use of the word universe, because that doesn't necessarily encapsulate all of space and time, although I think Lawrence Krauss's lectures would imply that it does. But the universe, as we know it in the Big Bang, is only sort of a state transition. Like the known universe that contains all the galaxies we have is not the same as like the set of everything that exists, as far as we know. I mean, like there could be like a bigger metaverse around the universe that started with the Big Bang, for all we know. So there's no certainty that the universe, in the sense of everything that exists, started with the Big Bang, or began to exist.
Okay. Yeah. No. And I could sympathize with that. I could. Okay. I could understand that. And that's typically why I don't like to go the Big Bang route. However, if we also don't, and I don't know if you do or not, allow the infinite regress, then if there was another, let's say there is another universe before our universe or whatnot, I personally don't believe that we can have an infinite amount of universes behind that.
But you believe in God, and you don't believe that God began to exist, right?
No, not at all.
So you believe that God is infinite. So you're just basically splitting hairs on some things can be infinite and some can't.
Not necessarily. No, it's if God is a timeless entity, in other words, not bound by time.
Well, who says the metaverse isn't a timeless entity?
Right.
So, okay, so in other words, just sort of a B theory of it just exists and there's no real...
Well, it's not, I wouldn't dignify it by calling it a theory because it's not something that's like tested, but you're trying to rule out all possible alternatives, and I'm saying, you know, you also need to be able to test it in order to rule that out. And that's why, as atheists, we usually say, in order to accept a God, a more productive line of argument would be to try to come up with some specific evidence that points specifically to a God actually existing, instead of just trying to remove every possible thing that isn't a God.
Instead of trying to remove everything that
right,
isn't
like, yeah, like with scientific reasoning, you generally look for evidence that points toward your specific theory.
Right.
And so I don't think the Kalam cosmological argument is, I mean, I don't get terribly excited by it just because it's trying to say, well, I can't think of anything other than a God that could match my conditions.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is there's a little bit of a, okay, do you understand that, like, if there's an argument that's framed a certain way, you can sometimes take that framing and apply it in another area to help somebody kind of understand why the argument doesn't work, right? So sometimes people will give the example of, you know, after this, therefore, because of this, and they want to illustrate how that might not work, and they'll give different examples, and they'll say, like, you know, every morning my rooster crows right before the sun comes up, therefore my rooster crowing causes the sun to come up. And it's just an illustration. It's like a little, you know, nobody would really say that, but it's an illustration of how the argument is flawed when you can see what happens when you plug things in and it doesn't work. And so what I tend to do is I look at the frame of God exists and causes this thing happened, therefore God. And that's kind of what Kalam falls into. And there's a lot of arguments that apologists put forward that fall into the same framing. And when I take that and I move it and say, let's use a parameter that's not your God. Let's look at something that's not your God so that we can just look at the argument framing here. And we can say, if I said gremlins exist and they break machines, I have seen machines break, therefore gremlins exist, right? Gremlins cause broken machines, machines break, therefore gremlins. You see immediately the flaw in that argument, correct?
Correct.
So if somebody says to me, God created the universe is here, therefore God, it's the same framing, right? So it's the same argument.
Right. But the argument itself isn't God created the universe exists, therefore God exists.
It kind of is. It's sort of the same argument with the Bible. They'll say, like, you know, God wrote the Bible, and I know this because if I look at the Bible, I see all these things that are just what a God would do. Right. And the universe thing is kind of the same way. They sit there and they look at the universe as it is and say, this is exactly the kind of universe that God would make. And I can say, this is exactly the kind of thing a gremlin would break. The fact is, I don't know what a gremlin would break because I don't know anything about gremlins. I've never examined one. And no one really that I think it's fair to say that we can probably discount someone saying they've examined a God and they can tell us what a God does or how it works and the mechanism of God. No. Okay, so if we're there, I mean, nobody knows what kind of universe a God would make or if a God even exists. There's a line that says things that don't exist can't be the cause of other things, which it's just, you know, I mean, it's nothing fancy about it. It's just a reality. And the idea is, unless a God exists, it could not have created this universe. It could not have created it in any way that it would have existed. We can't say what kind of a universe a God would create because we don't know what a God is. We don't know what it would create, if it even exists, or what it would do if it did exist. And so when we're looking at this universe as evidence of a God, we really don't even know what we're evaluating here. We first have to examine this God or have some information about the God in order to make some kind of an informed judgment about what it would do or how it would do it, and we don't have that.
Well, to me, there's a lot of information in there. I mean, we've got the sort of the quasi-objection of the metaverse, and then we've got the
metaverse isn't really an objection
specifically. The gremlin thing, which is not a direct comparison to plugging in to plugging in stuff into the Kalam itself. I do understand what you mean about, we can't necessarily speculate on what kind of a universe God would create.
Or if there even is a God that could have created it.
But the whole argument is to get to the conclusion that there is God. So we wouldn't want to say that there is a God. So here's my argument for it.
Well,
but that's kind of what it does, because at the end of it, when you have just the cause, it has to have a cause. In order to get to God, you have to start making assumptions that and the cause is God, because this is all these types of things that God would do.
Right. Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're assumption. I mean, at the end of the argument, it doesn't go, therefore the universe must have to exist, or therefore the universe has a cause, and that cause must be God. That's not where the argument cuts off.
Then it's not a compelling argument for God.
Well, yeah, but you have to, I think, dig down deeper through the premises to get to that point. I mean, it kind of seems as if though you're throwing it out there as if though it's a God of the gaps argument.
I think
it's only that, and it's only coming across that way because of the way that you're restating it. I don't necessarily think it gets us to that.
So let me address the Kalam cosmological argument directly, because you asked which of the premises are flawed, and I think the answer is kind of all of them. What begins to exist has to have a cause. Well, we don't necessarily know that in all situations, and that's where I think Lawrence Krauss's A Universe from Nothing would come in, where he's talking about the fact that matter and antimatter reactions are happening all the time without necessarily a reason. The universe began to exist. We don't know that, and it depends on what you mean by universe, like I said at the beginning of the call. And then, therefore, the universe has a cause. Well, since the first two premises are both kind of dubious, then that's just a conclusion from those two things that doesn't necessarily follow. And then, like you've both been saying, even if that's completely valid, it doesn't get you to a God. It's just convenient to call it a God.
Right. I wouldn't necessarily say it. Maybe let's say it would be fair that it fits the description of what I believe that a God is.
Okay. What do you believe a God is?
Okay. Well, I believe that a God is a supreme being, a maximally great being.
So if the Kalam cosmological argument was right, what would make it a being? I assume this being has intelligence, right?
Sure. Yeah. So what we're dealing with here is an eternal entity, okay? But when we have a temporal effect like the universe, but this also, you have to take into consideration that both the first and the second, basically the argument is correct. So just pretend with me right now.
Yeah, if I said that it was correct, what would the next step be?
Okay, so
but it's not.
How can an eternal entity bring about a temporal effect like the universe? The only way that I see that being possible is that it would have to make a conscious decision in order for it.
So intelligence is one of the most complicated things we know already.
Where did we even get that?
What?
Like, where did intelligence even come in? It's
part
part of his definition of a God, but I don't know where
that's my point.
I'm
where
not
did the
following how
intelligence
that got
come
inserted.
Okay, well, that derives from the premise that this being must be timeless, because if it wasn't timeless, then it would be subject to the problem of infinite regress that we run into with the sub-arguments of the second premise.
Oh, I guess, wait, I have an issue here because, we have existence, right? I mean, would you agree that existence is there are things that exist?
Yes.
Okay.
I would do that.
All right, and it sounds like what you're saying is that you think that, do you think that at some point there was like a state of complete non-existence that existed?